Hi everyone, Caitlin with Fluxx here. Thanks so much for joining me today in our Finding Fields in the Ad Hoc Report Builder webinar. If you should have any questions at any time during this webinar, please go ahead and type those in the Q&A section of your Zoom tool. We'll be dedicating the last few minutes for questions and answers, so we will be curating and saving all questions for then. Today's topic is finding fields in the Ad Hoc Report Builder. In this webinar, we are going to review some tips and tricks on how to navigate and locate fields when building ad hoc reports. So here are the tips we're going to review today. We'll want to have the Fluxx system glossary available, and I'll go ahead and define what that is. We want to determine what fields we want in our ad hoc reports up front and what those fields are labeled as. So I'll let you know how we can go ahead and figure that out. We want to confirm whether or not a field is actually a part of a component. We want to use the Fluxx system glossary to go ahead and find the corresponding backend name for any fields. And we'll want to use the hover over method and the preview button in the ad hoc report builder to confirm field selection. We'll also talk about why we want to include record IDs whenever possible. And then lastly, we want to establish when we'll want to drill down to other levels within an ad hoc report if needed. And as I'd mentioned, there will be a Q&A at the end of the session. So let's go ahead and get started. The first step in building an ad hoc report is to determine what fields you want to go ahead and include in that report. It can be helpful to start this process by creating a description sentence. In this example, we will start with the following sentence. I want a report that will show all grant requests, the organization name, the grant begin date, the requested and recommended amounts, and paid amounts. So that's a sentence that establishes what I want the report to do and what data I want pulled into my report. So let's go ahead and dissect that. After separating our sentence into the fields that I want, I've comprised the following list of the fields to include in the report. The first one is the grant or request ID. So I want to show all grants. And the best way of identifying a grant is by seeing its request or grant ID. The next field is the organization name. I want to know which program organization is linked as the primary on that record. Then I want to go ahead and pull in the grant begin date or start date. It might be labeled differently, and I'll let you know how we can check how that's labeled on the back end and the front end. And then the amount requested, the amount recommended, and then lastly, for my funding information, I want to go ahead and check out the payments for any grant or requests. So my first field is going to be the grant or request ID. As I'd mentioned earlier in the agenda, we highly recommend that when building an ad hoc report, we want the ID field included always, whenever possible. So if we're ever trying to link any data within the report to an existing record within the system, that could be a grant, that could be a grant request, a payment, or a request report, we want to go ahead and identify it as easily as possible, and that's going to be the request ID, the payment ID, the report ID, etc. So now that we have a good idea of what we want our report to look like, a good next step would be to open the Fluxx system glossary. So what is the Fluxx system glossary? It is a live report that you'll find in your site on the internal dashboard that lists all of the fields in your Fluxx instance. So that shows a field, if it's core or dynamic, it does not matter. It will show up in this report. So the report will include the backend name, which is the name that the system will look to, the label, which is the name of the report, or excuse me, of the field as you'd see it on a form, and any other useful information which I'll define for you now. So first you will go ahead and go into live reports. It's going to be a link next to your name up at the top right of your internal dashboard. And then the live reports modal will pop up on your screen. You'll want to scroll down in the list of live reports until you find Fluxx system glossary. Live reports are listed alphabetically, and any live reports that were built custom to your site will appear on the list before the alphabetically organized list of core live reports. So as you can see, we will go A through Z for any live reports that come with your site, and any that were built specifically for your site will show up before that A of the core live reports. But let's go ahead and click on Fluxx System Glossary. You'll see this pop up, and what this is we'll want to select what model types we'd like to see a glossary of the existing fields for. You'll go ahead and select the model type in the left-hand box. You'll click on the right arrow to move them to the right. If you are unsure of which model type you'd like to select and see the fields for, it's a good idea to go ahead and select all of the model types as we did here, and you can sort through the entire report after generating it. To go ahead and generate the report, you'll simply click on the View Document button here. The file will then download as an Excel spreadsheet. So this is what the Fluxx System Glossary file looks like once you've opened it. And as you can see, there is a column for model type, field name, label, use, theme name, form name, order, and legacy. The first column, the model type column, is exactly that. It'll list the model types in Fluxx, and that'll depend on which model types you have selected. So since we've selected all of them, we'll find all of the model types listed here and all the fields for each model type as well. The field name represents the back-end field name of that field. It's very useful to have this information when building ad hoc reports. It will often show in all lowercase letters with underscores as spaces between words in the back-end name. So as you can see here under account name, under the model type bank account, you'll see it says account underscore name, and it's all in lowercase letters. The next column is the label column, and that shows what the field is labeled as from the user's perspective on forms. The use column next to that will show if a field is dynamic or a core field, and if it is part of a form. This is key to checking for any duplicates or near duplicates of fields. Let's say that you or another admin have created a dynamic field named something similarly to a core field that had already existed on Fluxx before you created that new dynamic field. You can go ahead and check here for those types of items that you maybe want to delete or maybe want to clean house. You can go ahead and check out the use here on this Fluxx System Glossary. So let's keep this on the back burner. So we'll keep this on hand while we begin building our ad hoc report. To begin creating a new ad hoc report, you will simply want to open an ad hoc reports card from your add card menu. And once it has popped up on your dashboard, you'll go ahead and click on the green plus sign on the top right hand side of the card, as you can see we've indicated here. So once you've clicked that, you will see a list of the different model types upon which you can build the ad hoc report. Thus, the next step is to select the model type we want to build on. Since we have already decided which fields we want to include from our description sentence in the very beginning, let's think about where these fields live and how they relate to each other. In most cases, the grant request model type should be selected. This is because most of the fields that exist in Fluxx can be tied together by the grant request model type itself. Almost all of our fields can be found directly on the grant request card. Things become more complex if you've created dynamic fields on the reports model type or request transactions model type, so always think about the section of data you'll be extracting most of the information from. If a lot of the information pertains to grant request records, we'll go ahead and choose grant request as the model type. If a lot of the information specifically relates to payment records, we'll want to choose request transactions as the model type, so on and so forth. So we're going to select grant request and begin building our report. Keep in mind that we have the new ad hoc report builder enabled. If you are utilizing the old ad hoc report builder, which would show up directly in the ad hoc reports card on the internal dashboard after selecting a model type, things are going to look differently. You can always try enabling the new ad hoc report builder under general settings, in the admin panel on your pre-production site to test things and see how it goes and revisit this webinar if you'd like. We recommend doing that on pre-production just so that your users aren't shocked upon viewing the new builder. You can always turn it on or off in that general settings section. So let's get back to our ad hoc report. Once we've selected the model type, the report properties box appears. You'll want to give the report a name. Always name your report something unique and something that makes sense to what you're trying to accomplish. At some point, you might have many reports in your system, and therefore, you will want to make sure the name clearly represents the fields included in the report. So in this example, I've named my report Grant Information Report, as it's pretty general. It's not drilling down specifically for anything except for some general information about my grants and grant requests. You will notice that there are 4 different options listed for the report type. The 4 different types are Excel, CSV, pivot table, and PDF reports. For the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to select the Excel report type, which is the main general type of report that we can generate from the ad hoc reports. Please visit our knowledge base for an overview on the other types of reports. We've hosted a few webinars on the general gist of the ad hoc report builder, as well as some video recordings from our product team on how to utilize pivot tables. Now we can go ahead and begin adding fields to our report. Since it is always a good idea to include an ID whenever it is possible, we will begin by choosing the grant or request ID as our first field. We'll find all of our fields in the Field Explorer to the left-hand side. Notice that some fields have a plus sign. This means that you can drill down into that folder to view related fields. For now, we are looking for a field that exists directly on our grant request model, so we do not need to drill down into any other fields. So here are a couple of questions that might come across your mind. What do we do if we are unable to find the ID field we want? How do we know the name of that field in the ad hoc reporting tool is what we need? If you are having a problem finding a field, a good place to start is with the Fluxx system glossary that I showed you earlier. So let's go ahead and go back to that. So this is the same Fluxx system glossary report that we just ran. The first thing we will want to do is search in the appropriate model type. So in this case, we will want to scroll down or filter until we get to the grant request model type fields. You can see here that there is a field named Grant or Request ID. The corresponding label is named Grant or Request, as you can see under the label column, and it's a core field, as you can see under the use column. This is the field that we want. So let's go ahead and find it in the ad hoc report builder and add it to our report. So let's go ahead and find it. Even though there's a search bar at the top as I've indicated here, we want to keep in mind that we want to stay on our base level on the grant request. So a good tip here is instead of searching for keywords or looking for that field in there, we should actually just go ahead and scroll down in the list until you find the field that you're looking for, rather than to search for it. And this way you will know exactly what level the field lives on. So I'll give you a little bit more information. As you can see, the folders that have the plus sign tend to drill down deeper into an already core existing field on the model type in which you're building on. So since the request ID is its own field, we don't need to drill down. So really we can just scroll until we find it. Once you've found that field, let's go ahead and drag that field into our report by clicking directly on the name, holding your cursor onto that field, and then dragging it into the right side where you can see drag and drop report fields here. So this is it. And we're going to go ahead and drag it into the main body of the report. So let's say, we've done the Fluxx system glossary. We want to make sure that we're double checking and triple checking that that field is what we actually want and what we're looking for. A great tip is to hover over the name of the field like I did here. As you can see, there is a dark gray box with some white text. I'm simply hovering my cursor over the grant or request ID field. As you can see, I'm comparing that field name, which is the backend name, and remember that's going to be lowercase letters and underscores, and I'm comparing that to what I found in the Fluxx system glossary. You can also see a sample record below. It will give you a record ID if you simply want to triple check that this is exactly what I want. So you can check the record on your internal dashboard in a request card to see if things are matching up. So by hovering over this field, I know that I have the field that I want. So now let's continue adding our fields. The next field is the organization field. What we want is the organization name as part of my organization component. Even though you cannot pull a component into your report, all you have to do is check in the Fluxx glossary live report and find which fields pull information into the organization component. So oftentimes, and this isn't always the case, you'll be able to pull in separate pieces of information from components. Now, this differs from a different component, let's say the funding source allocation component. As you know, you're able to add funding source allocations from your funding sources on your grant requests. You're not typing in anything, you're not entering in any new data. But on the program organization component, you are entering in information. You're entering the name of the organization, the primary contact, the signatory, all that good stuff. So what you'll want to do is check to see if those fields exist individually. So let's go ahead and go back to the Fluxx system glossary. In the Fluxx system glossary, we see the field name here for the organization field that is part of the organization component as program organization. This is the core field, and it is part of the grant request. So this is the field that we want right here. As you can see, there are a bunch above and below that might be confusing. Again, we want that core field that's pulling in the information on the record itself. Now what we want to do is scroll down in the list until we find something similar to program organization. Since we are looking for the org name, we'll want to select the field named program org name. It specifically is calling for a string value, or it's a word instead of a number. We'll want to go ahead and pull that in, the program org name. Again, I want to double check that I have the correct field by hovering over the name of that field. So I can see here that I'm comparing it back to my Fluxx system glossary, and it's the right field. So let's go ahead and add it. Another way to make sure that you are on the right track is by using the preview button. So let's go ahead and see what happens once I click that. The preview button shows a preview of what the report will look like. So please note that this is only limited to a number of rows that will be displayed. So it's not the complete report. It's not going to mimic the actual generated report. It just provides a sample of the data that I'm pulling into my report. So now let's go ahead and add the grant start date using the same method that we've been using this time around in the webinar. As you can see here on my grant request card, this field is labeled start date. So we're going to go ahead and look for that label in our Fluxx system glossary. Since I don't see start date in my list of available fields in the ad hoc report tool, we're back at the glossary again. As you can see here, I found multiple fields named start date. The field name that correlates to start date is the grant begins at field. You can see that this is also the field name of the core field, and it is located on the grant request model type. Therefore, it is the correct field. One thing to take note of here is if you look in the label column, you will see that one of the labels is named project start date. As you can see here. This is still the same core field, it's just labeled differently. So as you can see, it says form builder under the use, and what that means is we've labeled it differently on different forms. You can always label your fields that you've added to your forms differently as it makes sense, or as you would like to on different themes of a model type. So as you can see in the field name, it's all the same, it's grant underscore begins underscore at, but the label can always differ. And by referring to the use column, you can see the core field, so the one that is used on the grant request, and where else you've used it in the form builder and labeled it differently. And you'll see in the theme name that we have used the same field and labeled it differently on a different theme. So that's all that means right there. Let's go ahead and add the core field to our report. Again, we want to stay on our base level. We're not drilling down into these folders, and so we're going to just go ahead and click and drag it into the report. Using the same method, I have added the amount requested and the amount recommended fields. These two fields are easy to find in the ad hoc report tool, since the field names in the ad hoc reporting tool are the same as the labels on the grant request card. Now, this is a good tip here for if you're ever creating a dynamic field. You'll want to make sure that the dynamic field in the label are something similar. Usually for the core fields, as I've mentioned before, if you do have the core field on several themes and you'd like to label it differently, that's perfectly fine. But upon creating a new dynamic field, it's always a good practice to go ahead and have that backend name something similar to your the label or the front end name. Of course, if you create a question, so the label will be a question, but the field name will be something different, that's also up to you. It's your prerogative on how you'd like to go ahead and locate these fields after the fact. So let's keep going. The last thing that we wanted to add is the payments information. So one thing to note is that one grant can have multiple payments. And we're wondering, how are we going to show all of the payments for one grant or grant request record? When you come across a situation such as this, the first thing to do is to enable one-to-many by checking the checkbox over to the right here. One-to-many should be enabled anytime there's a one-to-many type of situation. So, for example, one grant can have many payments. One organization can have many programs, and so on. Once I check the checkbox to enable one-to-many, I will want to select an item from the Create a Row for each, if included. So right here, this drop-down directly below, we'll want to go ahead and select what we want here. It auto fills with audits, which is the history component, so you'll want to change that. Since it's payments that we're after, we're going to go ahead and select Request Transactions from this list. So now let's get back to our glossary to find the field name for payments. This time I'm going to look at the Request Transactions model type. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar, it is always a good idea to add an ID whenever possible. So since payments have ID numbers, I'm going to go ahead and add that first, even though I didn't plan to initially. I can see here that the field labeled Payment ID has a field named of CanTag ID. So we've tried it in the request transaction. You can also filter at the top right of the black bar where it says model type, you'll see a funnel. You can actually filter for whatever model type in this if you've selected multiple. So I've done that. I've found that CanTag ID is listed and Payment ID is what I'm looking for. So this is the field that I'm going to go ahead and pull into my report. Up until now, we have stayed at the base level when selecting our fields. And that was because all of the fields we used lived directly on the grant request card. This time, however, that is not the case. To find the payments information, we are going to want to drill down into the Request Transactions folder here, as you can see as I've indicated. So once I click on that plus sign, you'll see a minus sign appear there. And what that means is I've expanded that folder. And now I can see all the fields that are part of the Request Transactions model type that are available to me on the grant request model type that on this, on this report. So all of those are made available below. The first field I want to add is the CanTag ID field. The field is named CanTag in the report builder, but as you can see when I hover over it, I can see the field name is the CanTag ID field that I'm looking for and found in my Fluxx system glossary. So now that I've dragged it over to the report, it is definitely a good idea to go ahead and rename it to a more useful name. As you can see in this text box right here, you can change the label of that field in your report. So it doesn't change the actual label of the field anywhere else except for this report that we're building here. So I've gone ahead and changed it to Payment ID so that it makes more sense once I'm looking at my report. An amount paid is another field that has its labeled identical to its field name. So I've gone ahead and added that so that I can see how much was paid for that payment. And the ID will correspond to that as well. So I've gone ahead and dragged that into the report. And now that we have successfully added all of our fields, let's go ahead and save our report by clicking on the Save button right here. After saving the report, you'll return to your internal dashboard and we'll return to the Ad Hoc Reports card. We can then see the report that we've just created, oftentimes at the top, and there will be a real-time update once that happens. So now that we've created it, we've found it in the Ad Hoc Report card, we want to go ahead and generate the report. So what you'll want to do to generate the report is click on the Generate Report button at the bottom right of the card. As soon as the report is completed, so it's completely downloaded, you will see a real-time update at the top of the screen right here. And then you will find it available to download at any time under Ad Hoc Report Documents. And of course, this this label can be different. It might just say ad hoc reports. It might say generated reports. Simply the component in the ad hoc card will show you what you've downloaded and at what time and what date. Now, let's say that you do not see your report showing up in your ad hoc report card. A couple of helpful tips. Simply refreshing using the real-time update, as I've mentioned at the top of the card, making sure that the card is up to date, or simply refreshing your entire browser. So if you click on refresh to refresh the page, you'll see it. And again, if that's still not happening, simply go into the admin panel, and you'll find the queue over to the left-hand side where you've accessed forms and workflow. You'll see queue as an option. If you click on that, it'll lead you to the jobs queue. And what that is a queue of all of the download jobs that you have done on your site. So oftentimes you can find the ad hoc report generated there as well. So now that I've gone ahead and opened up my generated report, here's the sample of the report we just built. Please note that this report was run against a test database, which is why not all of the cells contain data. And as you can see, rows 2 through 9 are all of the same grant ID. Now this makes sense because there are multiple payments for this one grant, and that's because we enabled on one-to-many. We are also able to validate our data by looking at the grant request IDs and the payment IDs, and we can cross-reference that in the respective cards by searching for those IDs. So this concludes today's webinar on selecting fields when building ad hoc reports. I hope you enjoyed it. To review, today we went over the following tips. We want to have the Fluxx system glossary on hand and available at all times. We want to determine your fields before beginning the build of the report. We want to determine that those fields are labeled accordingly based on comparing it with the Fluxx system glossary and how it looks in the ad hoc report. We want to confirm whether or not any fields are part of a component. And using the glossary, we want to find the corresponding backname for any fields. We want to use the hover over method to go ahead and expand that bubble and preview button as you go to confirm your field selection. Always include IDs when possible for any records, if records are involved, so payments, reports, reviews, grant requests. We want those IDs so that we can always cross-reference the data. And lastly, we want to establish when we need to drill down to another level as opposed to the base level for that model type whenever needed. So let's go ahead and open it up to questions. All right, so we have a couple of questions. The first one is that you mentioned the model type most often used as a grant request model type. Can any report be created using the grant request model type? And if so, is this what you recommend? So yes, theoretically, you can create any report by starting with the grant request model type. However, this is not necessarily what we recommend doing. It's best to determine what fields you are looking for and need, and then determining which model type you should build the report on. So for example, if you were building a report that only had to do with payments and funding information, you're probably better off selecting the request transactions model type. And then also, how can I use filters to make my report more dynamic? All right, so next week we're actually going to be hosting a webinar on ad hoc report filters, so go ahead and check that out. We'll be talking about the basic filters, the advanced filtering, and the runtime filter option. All right, thank you so much. User had submitted a wonderful compliment. Thank you very much. We really appreciate that. We really hope that you enjoy these trainings that we're putting out every week. We always love it when you tune in, and we are always happy to host you. So keep joining and keep learning. So we're going to go ahead and call it for today. To learn more and access a video recording of this webinar along with any extended Q&A, please go ahead and visit our knowledge base at fluxx.io/knowledge. There you'll be able to find a list of our upcoming webinars, links to register for future webinars, and recordings of past webinars under the folder Training Webinar Videos. Feel free to reach out to us at training@fluxxlabs.com for questions or suggestions for future webinars. And also you can contact us via the training community on the community site. So please go ahead and check that out and let us know how we're doing and what you'd like to see. And also always feel free to send an email to support@fluxxlabs.com if you experience anything with the ad hoc report builder that you need help with. So thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to hosting you in our future webinars and workshops. Thanks again.